The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart's emergency department hummed their tired, mechanical song. Katie Morrison stood at the supply station, organizing trauma shears with the kind of precision that suggested her hands had learned order in places where chaos killed people. Her Navy-issue watch, a Seiko that had survived 3 deployments, read 6:38 a.m. Staff changeover. The quiet before the first wave of the broken arrived. She moved through the ward like water, noticed by almost no one. The residents talked over her. The attending physicians asked questions without waiting for answers. The charge nurses assigned her the worst assignments and thanked her with the tone reserved for vending machines. Katie accepted this with the economy of someone who had learned that visibility often preceded pain. In the bottom of her locker, wrapped in surgical tape and tucked behind a jacket she never wore, sat a pair of combat boots. Tan leather. Scuffed at the heels. Worn through at the toe box. They smelled like Baghdad dust even now, 15 months later, which was impossible but true. The boots belonged to Marcus Chen, the patient who'd been waiting for a bed in the neuro ward for 6 hours. The boots had been in his lap when he arrived, and Katie had recognized the grip of a man holding onto something more than leather and laces. She had asked him once why he carried them. Because forgetting is the same as drowning, Marcus had said, and Katie understood with the kind of understanding that comes from muscle memory, not words. The scar tissue on her left palm itched when the weather changed. It was thin scar tissue, barely visible now, the kind that came from shrapnel that had embedded itself at an angle that just missed the tendons. She'd learned to hide her hands in pockets during moments of stress. Learned to keep her voice level when alarms spiked. Learned to move with the controlled momentum of someone who had already survived the worst and understood that panic was a luxury. Katie had not told anyone at Sacred Heart where she had learned to move like that. Had not mentioned the 3 deployments. Had not used her rank, Senior Chief Petty Officer, in a conversation that mattered. She had walked away from the Navy 18 months ago, after the PTSD had metastasized from a manageable tremor in her hands to a full-body condition that made her wake at 2:13 a.m. certain that the fluorescent lights above her bed were muzzle flashes. She had chosen Sacred Heart's night shift because it was quiet. Chosen anonymity because it was safer than explanation. Chosen the name Katie Morrison on her badge, her mother's maiden name, because the woman she had been on 3 continents could not survive in the place where she had decided to heal. The supply station smelled of antiseptic and the particular staleness of air that had been recycled through hospital ventilation for 8 hours. Katie's hands worked through inventory, trauma shears, suction catheters, 14-gauge angiocath needles, each item in its designated slot. The work was meditative. The work was control. "You pulling Marcus today?" Her colleague, Diane, asked this while pouring coffee that looked like a medical waste hazard. "Transport to the beach," Katie said. "Summer festival." He wanted to go. Diane made a face. The expression of someone whose generosity extended only to the point of policy compliance. "That's nice. You're good to him." Katie did not respond. Nice was the word people used when they meant invisible. Good meant compliant. She finished organizing the sutures and moved to the neuro ward where Marcus sat in a specialized wheelchair, the kind with the reinforced frame and the tilt mechanism that kept his spine aligned when his lower body had stopped being a useful part of his life. He was already dressed. The wheelchair had been positioned facing the window so he could see the light changing in the parking lot. In his lap, the combat boots rested against his thighs, his hands curved around them like he was protecting something fragile. "Morning," Katie said. "Morning, Chief," Marcus replied, and Katie's breath caught in a way she hoped was invisible. He did not know. He could not know. But the word, Chief, had escaped his mouth like a secret, like his body remembered something his mind had not been told. Katie's hands steadied themselves through habit and will. She had learned to absorb shocks without reaction. The kind of composure that comes from having held pressure on arterial bleeding while explosions walked closer. "Ready?" she asked, and her voice remained level as still water. The Portland beach sprawled across the summer morning like an invitation. The boardwalk had been transformed for the festival, strings of white light still hung from the eaves of the concession stands, deflated now in daylight. Vendor booths lined the perimeter. The accessible ramp to the shoreline was painted fresh blue and marked with official signage that made Katie trust it more than she should have. The crowd had begun assembling by 10:22 a.m., families, couples, elderly people with metal detectors, children already sugared by early funnel cakes. The air smelled like salt water and kettle corn and the particular excitement of people who believed nothing bad could happen in public. Katie pushed Marcus's wheelchair along the smooth concrete of the boardwalk. His hand still clutched the boots. She had learned not to ask questions about the things people carried. The wound was the wound. Everything else was just how you learned to move around it. The beach manager's office was positioned at the entrance to the boardwalk, a small structure with large windows that allowed maximum visibility. Derek Hollis stood in the doorway, a man whose build suggested he had once been muscular and had now allowed that muscle to convert to leverage, the kind of authority that came from holding office before, and from whatever political connections had allowed him to transition from city councilman to beach manager with the ease of someone moving between rooms in a house he owned. He wore a polo shirt with the Portland Parks Department logo embroidered above his heart. His sunglasses were the expensive kind. His watch cost more than Katie made in a month. He spotted them on the boardwalk, and something in his face changed. Not all the way into a frown. Not yet. Just a micro-contraction of the muscles around his eyes that suggested the sight of Marcus's wheelchair had registered as something unpleasant. Something that needed categorizing. The ramp to the shoreline access was 40 feet away. Katie maintained their trajectory with the kind of steady momentum that suggested she was not aware of Hollis watching, which was false but necessary. What happened next did not just silence a corner of the boardwalk. It divided the morning into before and after, though none of the crowd gathered would remember this moment as significant until much later, when the context had been rebuilt and the stakes had been made clear. Derek Hollis did not stay in the doorway. He walked toward them with the comfortable assumption of someone whose role in a space gave him the right to intercept. His movements were not threatening. They were something worse, casual. The kind of casualness that suggested he did not perceive Marcus Chen or Katie Morrison as requiring any particular consideration. Katie pushed the wheelchair forward. 12 more feet to the ramp. "Hey," Hollis called out. Not loud. Conversational. Beach is for people who can actually enjoy it, you understand? You probably want to head home. Katie did not break stride. Her hands on the wheelchair grips remained steady. Her breathing remained level. "I'm talking to you, nurse," Hollis continued. "That's a safety issue. We can't have liability situations in the public area." 1,500 miles away, in a valley that had a name but would not be spoken aloud, Katie had once held pressure on a wound while a mortar round adjusted fire and walked closer. The tremor in her hands had been fear then. It was not fear now. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that comes from understanding that violence was a choice, not a requirement. The ramp was 8 feet away now. Katie's hands gripped the wheelchair handles as the boardwalk materialized ahead, salt air mixing with carnival music and the smell of fried food. Portland Beach in July, summer festival season. Families clustered around vendor booths. Children splashed in the shallow roped-off swimming area. The accessible ramp cut through the sand like a promise kept. 8 feet away. 7. 6. "Hey everyone, look at the cripple who thinks he can enjoy the beach like normal people." The voice came like a foghorn. Derek Hollis, beach manager, former city councilman, the kind of man who wore his authority like a cologne that lingered too long in confined spaces. He stood near the festival's information booth, sunglasses pushed up on his forehead, khaki shorts pressed sharp enough to cut. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. Behind him, a cluster of younger staff members turned to look. Some laughed. Some didn't. All of them watched. Katie kept her hand steady on the wheelchair. Kept her breathing even. One measured breath in. One measured breath out. This was not new. This was routine. Marcus Chen sat rigid in the chair, his fingers white-knuckling the armrests. His prosthetics lay in a canvas bag beneath the seat. The worn combat boots, desert tan, scuffed from Baghdad sand that no amount of cleaning could remove, rested in his lap like relics. His jaw clenched. "Let's keep moving," he said quietly, but his voice carried the tremor of a man who'd learned to survive humiliation the same way soldiers survive ambushes, by moving forward. Hollis stepped directly into their path. His presence seemed to expand, filling the space between the ramp and the water beyond. He kicked sand toward the wheelchair, a casual arc that landed across Marcus's lap and the boots, dusting them like seasoning. "Maybe Nurse here should take her charity case somewhere else before he ruins everyone's day," Hollis said, voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Some of us actually paid to be here." The laughter rose again. "Not everyone. But enough." Katie watched the sand settle on those boots. She'd seen Marcus clean them that morning, his ritual, a meditation on memory. She'd watched his hands move with the precision of a man trying to control something, anything, when so much had already been taken. The sand would come off. But Hollis wouldn't. She wiped her eye once, just once, and did not break eye contact with him. "The only thing ruined here," she said, voice pitched low enough that only Hollis could hear, though something in the delivery made the crowd press closer anyway, "is your understanding of what sacrifice looks like." The words landed like a scalpel, precise, bloodless, devastating. Hollis's face flushed. His hand came up, then stopped. He turned away, but not before Katie caught something darker in his expression. Not anger. Calculation. The look of a man recalibrating his approach, the way a predator studies prey that moves faster than expected. She pushed Marcus forward. The ramp inclined gently toward the sand. Behind them, the festival continued, music, laughter, the mechanical whir of a Ferris wheel. But Hollis remained at the booth, watching them cross the beach. Watching them set up a folding umbrella in the designated accessible zone 40 yards from the water. Watching as Marcus gripped the boots tighter and finally allowed his shoulders to drop. Katie pulled a chair beside his wheelchair, settled into it, and didn't speak for 3 minutes. The ocean moved in predictable rhythms. Waves came. Waves retreated. Salt evaporated. The sun pressed down like a weight. "He'll make trouble," Marcus said finally. Katie nodded once. "Probably. You should have let him walk over us." "Why would I do that?" Marcus turned toward her, and something in his expression shifted, not gratitude exactly, but recognition. The look of one soldier seeing another hold the line when retreat was easier. Because most people would have. Katie watched the water. "I'm not most people." By late afternoon, as the festival crowd thinned and families began packing folding chairs and coolers, Hollis had positioned himself at the beach office, a small wooden structure overlooking the accessible area. Every time Katie moved to adjust Marcus's umbrella, every time she helped him shift position, Hollis watched. Every time she walked to the concession stand for water, she felt his gaze tracking her. It was the surveillance of a man documenting evidence, collecting ammunition. At 4:53 p.m., a beach volunteer approached them, a college kid with nervous energy radiating off him in waves. "The manager wants to know if everything's, okay." The question landed like it had been rehearsed. Katie could see the script Hollis had handed him written across his face. "Everything's fine," Katie said. The volunteer lingered. "He said if you need anything, we should probably." "We don't need anything." "He left." Katie registered the glance back over his shoulder, the way he'd report this refusal to Hollis, how that refusal would be transformed into evidence of something, difficulty, resistance, the wrong attitude. She'd seen this before. Not at beaches, but in the same fundamental architecture of power. A hierarchy establishing itself by finding threats and neutralizing them. What she did not anticipate was how quickly Hollis would move. The evening shift change happened at 6:13 p.m. The sun was still high, but the angle had shifted, casting longer shadows across the sand. That's when Katie's phone buzzed, a text from Sacred Heart Hospital, where she'd picked up per diem shifts 3 days a week. The kind of work that demanded no references, no background checks, no questions about why a woman with her hands moved with the precision of someone trained to save lives in impossible conditions wanted to quietly move a patient to the surgical unit at night. The text came from Dr. Hargrove, the attending physician who'd made it clear on her first shift that he appreciated her competence but not her presence. That he found her steady hands and careful movement somehow threatening in a way he couldn't quite articulate. That he'd made a decision about her before they'd ever spoken. The message was direct: don't bother coming in tonight. Your shift's been reassigned. We'll discuss scheduling next week. No explanation. No context. Just the deletion. Katie stared at the phone for 9 seconds. Hollis was no longer at the booth. He'd moved closer, though, positioned near the parking lot with his own phone pressed to his ear, as locked on her across the distance. When he caught her looking, he smiled. Not the professional smile of moments before. The smile of someone who'd found her pressure point and was already squeezing. "What is it?" Marcus asked. Katie set the phone down. "Nothing. Just work confirming tomorrow." It was the first lie she'd told him, and they both knew it. At 7:22 p.m., the beach began its transition to evening. Families packed up. The festival crew started dismantling booths. The volunteers moved through the sand with trash bags and flashlights. And Hollis, positioned now at the parking lot entrance, made another call, his third in 20 minutes. Katie watched him gesture toward the accessible zone, watched his jaw move with words she couldn't hear but could absolutely predict: yes, the nurse, no medical credentials, potential liability, the veteran, unsupervised. The architecture of destruction was simple. A man with access to communication, authority connections, and the ability to make professional relationships conditional. A man building a case without her ever sitting down to defend herself. That was the system. That was always the system. But Katie had survived worse than systems. Marcus watched her watching Hollis. "What do we do?" Katie picked up the worn combat boots, held them for a moment, feeling the weight of desert dust, of memories, of everything these boots had carried before their owner lost his legs to the same war that had nearly consumed her. "We enjoy the sunset," she said. "And tomorrow we figure out if the beach manager has any idea who he just decided to make an enemy." 20 minutes after Derek Hollis walked away, the festival crowd had swallowed him whole, lost in the blur of summer heat and cotton candy vendors. Katie stood at the accessible ramp, watching Marcus grip his worn combat boots tighter in his lap, the leather creased from years that had nothing to do with wardrobes. The ocean breeze carried salt and diesel exhaust from the food trucks. She was about to wheel him closer to the water when the first sound reached her, not the ocean, not the crowd noise, but the specific choking silence that means someone's airway has closed. A teenage boy, maybe 16, stood 40 feet away on the crowded boardwalk. His face was the color of eggplant. His hands clutched at his throat. His mother stood beside him, frozen, mouth open in a shape that wasn't quite a scream yet. Katie moved before her brain finished processing. Not walked. Moved. Like muscle memory had been waiting for this exact moment for 7 years. The wheelchair stopped. Her badge clattered against the tile, except there was no tile, only sand and wood planking, the sound still sharp and distinct in her mind even as her body was already in motion. The crowd did what crowds do. They gathered. They panicked. They stood in the way. Derek Hollis appeared from near the beer garden, chest puffed, his authority suddenly worth nothing against a boy who couldn't breathe. He opened his mouth as if to take command. Closed it. His face went slack because he had no idea what to do, and everyone could see it. Katie was there in 8 seconds. She'd counted them automatically, the way you count heartbeats under torture. She positioned herself behind the boy's back, her hands finding the correct position, upper abdomen, just above the navel, well below the sternum. She'd done this in a swaying helicopter over Kandahar province with one hand while holding and fall line with the other. This was nothing. This was breathing room. "I've got him," she said. Not a question. Not a request. Her hands moved on their own. The embrace was firm but not violent. She pressed her clasped hands upward and inward. A sharp, sudden compression. The boy's body lurched forward. His mouth opened and something dark came out, a piece of hot dog, maybe a walnut from one of the snack vendors, something that had won a silent war with his airway and was losing now. He gasped. Wheezed. Coughed. The crowd exhaled like a single organism. Katie didn't wait for the coughing to fully resolve. She already had his arm, already guiding him down to a seated position on the boardwalk. Her eyes moved across his face with the speed of someone who'd conducted triage on stretchers in Baghdad, reading facial flushing, checking the capillaries around his lips, noting the slight swelling at the corner of his mouth. Her hands were steady as surgical steel as she ran them along his face and neck, assessing for signs of allergic reaction. The swelling was already accelerating. It wasn't just the choking. His lips were puffy. His voice, when he tried to speak, came out a whisper that sounded like wind through a narrowed pipe. Anaphylactic, Katie said, not to the crowd but to the paramedics who weren't here yet and to the pharmacist who wasn't here yet and to every protocol she'd memorized in training. Probable shellfish or tree nut. What? The boy's mother was there now, hands shaking. What's wrong with him? Airway compromise. Katie kept her voice level, the voice she used when patients were crashing and panic would kill them faster than the actual disease. I need the first aid station. Where's the first aid station? A vendor pointed. North side of the pavilion. Katie's eyes calculated the distance, 80 meters maybe. The boy's swelling was advancing at an alarming rate. His breathing was becoming more labored, each inhalation a struggle against rapidly closing throat tissue. Call 911, Katie ordered someone in the crowd. Tell them anaphylaxis. Estimated ETA for paramedics. A woman with a phone, they said 6 minutes. 6 minutes. The boy's airway would be completely closed in 3, maybe 4 if she was lucky. Katie ran. Walked, technically, because she didn't allow herself the indulgence of panic running, but her heart rate had shifted into a lower, cleaner pattern, the way it felt when missiles were launching and time became something else, something measurable and precise. The first aid station was a small white box mounted on the pavilion wall, next to a laminated sign about water safety and riptides. The EpiPen was there. Standard epinephrine auto-injector, 0.3 milligrams IM for an adolescent. She was back at the boy's side in 43 seconds. She'd counted them again, automatic as breathing. I'm giving you epinephrine, she told the boy. It's going to feel like pressure in your leg. That's normal. She didn't ask permission. She pulled up his shorts leg, located the anterior lateral thigh muscle, and jabbed the EpiPen through cloth and into flesh. The needle's resistance lasted exactly 3/4 of a second. Then the smooth release of medication into tissue. She held it for 10 seconds, the auto-injector required 10, she remembered that perfectly, every training scenario, every renewal certification, and then withdrew. The boy's breathing changed almost immediately. The wee shifted to a deeper, more open sound. His shoulders came down from his ears. His eyes, which had been wide and animal panicked, began to focus again. Keep lying down, Katie instructed, already positioning him on his back, elevating his legs on a beach towel someone handed her. She could taste the salt air now, could hear the carousel music from the festival 2 blocks over, could feel the sun on her shoulders. Her hands were moving through a physical exam, checking pupil response, listening to breath sounds, assessing skin color. His mother was crying. Derek Hollis was standing 10 feet away, watching something happen that he didn't understand and couldn't control. A crowd of 40-plus people had stopped what they were doing to watch a nurse they didn't know keep a child from dying. The paramedics arrived in 5 minutes 58 seconds. Katie knew because she was counting, the same way she'd counted minutes in a military hospital tent in Baghdad while the sound of mortar fire rattled the canvas and she'd worked on a SEAL whose chest had been opened by shrapnel. The paramedics had training and protocols, but Katie's voice dropped an octave when she briefed them. Anaphylactic reaction, probable food trigger, she said. Choking episode preceded it by 3 minutes. Single epinephrine 0.3 mg IM administered at T-5 minutes. Airway currently patent. Breathing easy. O2 saturation at, she'd already checked the portable pulse oximeter on his finger, 98% and stable. The lead paramedic, a woman in her 40s with the cool signs of experience carved into her face, met Katie's eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Something passed between them in that moment, the kind of recognition that only happens between people who've done this work in places where it actually mattered. Where 98% oxygen saturation wasn't just a number, it was the difference between a child who went home and a child who didn't. Secondary injection, the paramedic asked. Should be administered at hospital, Katie replied. But he's stable for transport. Vitals are solid. The paramedic hesitated. Then extended her hand. Not to shake. To help Katie up from the ground where she'd been kneeling, because Katie was on her knees and hadn't noticed. The medic's grip was firm, the hand of someone who'd held lives together. When their hands touched, the paramedic's eyes flickered. Just for a moment. Like she'd recognized something in Katie's calluses, in the way her hands moved with absolute certainty, in the specific clinical language she'd used. The EpiPen was already being documented, the boy was already on the stretcher, oxygen mask in place, and 4-line being established with the same precision Katie would have used. The mother was being guided toward the ambulance. The crowd was already beginning to disperse, the crisis moment already becoming a story they'd tell later. And then Derek Hollis did something that made his hands tremble. He walked directly to a lifeguard and began speaking in low, urgent tones. Pointing at Katie. Making gestures that suggested something had gone wrong, something had been done incorrectly, something that required immediate reporting. His phone was already in his hand. His fingers were already moving. Katie watched him make the calls, she couldn't hear them, but she could read his mouth, could see the way he was positioning himself, could see how quickly his shock had transformed into strategy. He was calling someone. Then someone else. Then a third person, this one a longer conversation, his voice dropping but his posture becoming more confident, like each call was rebuilding his authority brick by brick. Marcus rolled his wheelchair beside her, the worn combat boots still in his lap. He's scared, Marcus said quietly. Yeah. He's making calls. I know. The sun was dropping lower now, the festival winding down, the smell of fried food and ocean mixing into something that would have been pleasant if the air around them hadn't begun to feel like the moment before a detonation. Derek Hollis was no longer the man who'd kicked sand and made jokes. He was something else now, a man who'd witnessed the hierarchy he controlled be utterly dismantled by someone he'd decided was powerless. And men like that always escalate. What they didn't know, what Derek Hollis couldn't possibly know as he stood there making his calls and rebuilding his armor, was that every second of Katie's performance on that boardwalk had been recorded. And that every person present was already reshaping the narrative in their minds. And that a 16-year-old boy whose mother was currently riding in an ambulance would eventually ask, very specifically, who the woman was who'd saved his life using techniques that seemed far more advanced than any beach first aid protocol required. The boy's mother would remember. The paramedics would remember. The 40-plus witnesses would remember. And Derek Hollis's phone calls were about to become evidence of something far more damaging than a beach manager protecting his authority. But that night, as Katie waited for the bus at the corner of Morrison and 3rd, her cardboard box balanced on her knees, a cracked mug inside, a photo of someone who didn't make it out of Baghdad, a plant that was already half dead, she had no way of knowing what was coming. She only knew that she'd kept her identity buried for 7 years, that she'd walked away from everyone and everything that might have led back to who she'd been, and that today she'd made a mistake. She'd let the work speak louder than the silence. Within the hour, Derek Hollis's phone was already burning. He stood in his beachside office, salt-stained windows framing the perfect Portland afternoon behind him, and dialed the park's director with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent 20 years collecting favors like other people collected lint. She assaulted him, Hollis said, his voice smooth as resort brochure copy. The boy. Victim's name is Tyler Chen. She performed some kind of unauthorized medical procedure without proper beach safety certification. I have witnesses. Could have been worse, could have caused internal injuries, broken ribs, who knows? We need to protect liability before this blows up. The lie sat between them like a third person in the conversation. He hung up and smiled, already picturing how this would unfold. She'd overstepped. She'd practiced medicine without the proper credentials. He had documentation, forms he could have filled out wrong, policies she technically hadn't followed because they didn't exist yet. A good administrator always found the grey area. That was power. The beach was still in full summer festival swing. Tourists moved through the boardwalk like schools of fish, buying overpriced corn dogs and carnival prizes. Hollis had built this into what it was, a destination, a place where families spent money, where his word meant something. One nurse with a god complex wasn't going to change that. Especially not one who didn't know how to stay in her lane. He'd already called 3 board members. One was a lawyer. One controlled the hospital's insurance contracts. By the time sunset hit, the investigation would be underway. By morning, she'd be gone. The knock on his office door came at 4:08 p.m. A Parks Department investigator in a polo shirt with a municipal seal, clipboard already loaded with questions. Professional. Efficient. Exactly what Hollis had anticipated. I received a report regarding a medical incident and potential licensing violations, the investigator said. He didn't smile. Didn't need to. This was his job, follow the paperwork, file the reports, let the bureaucracy do what it did best. Katie was still on the beach when they found her. Not far from the accessible ramp where Marcus had sat that morning. She was helping a child build a sandcastle, her hand steady, her movements precise even in something so small and useless. She didn't see them coming until the investigator was already speaking. Katie Morrison? I'm going to need you to come with me. She stood. Sand fell from her scrubs in a soft cascade. She didn't ask questions. That was the thing about Katie, she never fought. Never protested. Never made a scene. She simply accepted what came, as if she'd been trained her entire life to absorb punishment without speaking back. The incident with the teenager, the investigator said. His clipboard made a sound like bone on bone as he flipped pages. You're not certified to perform emergency medical procedures at this location. The victim's parents are concerned about potential injuries. We've received a formal complaint. Effective immediately, you're banned from this beach. Over his shoulder, Derek Hollis stood with his sunglasses on, that small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The smile of someone who'd just moved a problem off his board. Katie nodded. One small motion. She looked at the child still crouched by the half-built castle, then back at the investigator. I understand. She walked off the beach without gathering her things. Without arguing. Without even looking back at Hollis, which was somehow more powerful than any insult could have been, the simple act of refusing to acknowledge him at all. That evening, Katie sat at a bus stop 3 blocks from her studio apartment, a cardboard box balanced on her lap. The rain had started around 5:22 p.m., the kind of Portland rain that didn't arrive as drops but as a persistent mist, coating everything in a thin layer of wet. Her scrubs were already soaked. She didn't move. Inside the box, a cracked coffee mug from the hospital break room, something someone had given her years ago. A dying succulent she'd been trying to keep alive on her windowsill, its leaves wilted and pale. And a photograph, worn at the edges, showing a man in desert fatigues with his arm around her shoulder. His name was Ortiz. He'd been a combat medic too. They'd served together in Baghdad 7 years ago, before the convoy took a wrong turn and an IED rewrote the equation of his life into a binary code, alive, then not. She'd kept that photograph for 7 years. Moved it from apartment to apartment, never showing it to anyone, never mentioning him by name. She'd walked away from the Navy, from the unit, from everyone who might have asked about it. She'd chosen silence and anonymity and a quiet nursing job where nobody knew her name, nobody asked about her background, nobody expected anything except that she show up and do her job. And she'd convinced herself that was healing. The rain hit her face in soft, insistent waves. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from something deeper. Anger, maybe. Or recognition. She'd spent 7 years giving bullies silence. She'd let Derek Hollis think she was powerless because she never fought back. She'd let his mockery land because she absorbed it without defense. And in doing so, she'd given him exactly what he needed, permission to believe he'd won. She looked at the photograph again. Ortiz had never been quiet. Even after everything, even after the body count got too high and the mission stopped making sense, he'd spoken. He'd been loud about it. That was what killed him, not the convoy, not the IED, but his refusal to stay silent about what was breaking him. He'd reached out for help. And there was nobody there. Katie had learned the opposite lesson. She'd learned that silence was safer. That staying invisible meant staying untouched. She almost threw the photograph away. Her hand actually moved toward the rain-soaked pavement, the box tilting slightly. This was it. The bottom. This was what rock bottom felt like, sitting wet and alone at a bus stop with a cardboard box containing the last physical remnants of a person she used to be. But then she stopped. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the box. She pulled it back. She held the photograph of Ortiz in both hands, water dripping from her palms, and she made a decision that would echo through everything that came after. She wouldn't throw it away. Not because she was weak, but because weakness wasn't silence. Weakness was what happened when you let someone else define your voice. Ortiz hadn't been weak. He'd been loud. He'd been visible. And the world had failed to hear him anyway. But Katie was still here. And she had learned something 7 years of silence couldn't teach her, that sometimes the only way to honor the people you couldn't save was to stop hiding the person you'd become. The rain intensified. A distant sound cut through it, mechanical, rhythmic, the kind of sound she hadn't heard in 7 years. She looked up at the sky, water streaming down her face, and she heard it again. Rotors. Helicopter rotors, still far away but getting closer. She had no idea what was about to happen next. The helicopter rotors grew louder. Closer. Katie sat rigid on the bus stop bench, rain streaming down the cardboard box in her lap, when the sound split the Portland sky open. She didn't look up. Didn't need to. The pitch of those blades meant military. Black Hawk or Chinook. She'd recognize that sound in a coma. The rotor wash hit the street like a physical hand. 3 blocks away, Marcus Chen lay in his apartment staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, listening to the same sound. His daughter, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, stood in dress whites at the foot of his bed. Immaculate. Furious. The Navy Cross on his dresser caught the afternoon light, the medal she'd never seen him wear. He's still out there, Sarah said quietly. The one who got you home. Marcus didn't answer. Couldn't. The weight of what Derek Hollis had done to Katie Morrison, that name wasn't even her real identity in his mind, it was just the face of someone who'd asked nothing and given everything, sat in his chest like shrapnel. Sarah moved to the window. Down on the beach boardwalk, Derek Hollis was unlocking his office at the beach management station. The sun hung low and orange. She'd waited until the end of shift on purpose. What Hollis didn't know was that the local news crews had already arrived. Witnesses to the choking rescue had uploaded their videos, 47 minutes of footage showing Katie Morrison performing an emergency Heimlich with textbook precision, identifying anaphylactic shock, running for an EpiPen, monitoring vitals like a woman who'd done this before. The kind of before that didn't exist for a quiet nurse with 2 years at Sacred Heart. Sarah had called them herself. She wheeled her father toward the beach in the sodium-light dusk, his combat boots balanced across his lap. The same boots he'd worn in Baghdad. The same boots he hadn't touched in 7 years until Katie Morrison had come into his life. Hollis was closing his office door when he heard the crowd. Footsteps. Camera lights cutting through the gathering dark. He turned to find Sarah Chen in dress whites, Navy insignia, commanding presence, walking toward him with a face that could stop a convoy. Behind her, Marcus in his wheelchair. Behind them, news cameras. Behind those, at least 40 people holding phones. Hollis's smile died. He tried to step back inside. "Derek Hollis?" Sarah's voice carried across the boardwalk like a command. "You're about to meet someone you grossly underestimated." The cameras swung toward him. Lights flooded his face. "The woman you humiliated this morning is Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison," Sarah announced, her voice steady as a rifle sight. "United States Navy. Navy Cross recipient. 2 Purple Hearts. Combat medic, 3 decorated deployments, and the reason my father is still alive to sit on this beach." The crowd shifted. Phone cameras refocused. A beach volunteer who'd been watching from the management station stepped forward, trembling, holding Marcus's medical file. Her voice shook as she read aloud. "Battlefield thoracotomy performed under fire, Jolan District, Baghdad. Patient stabilized and evacuated. Survival probability at time of injury, 8%. Hollis's face drained the color of old bone. A SEAL team leader emerged from the crowd, Captain James Mercer, 3rd Battalion, with the bearing of a man who'd seen actual warfare. His voice didn't rise. "Didn't need to. I served with Senior Chief Morrison. She saved 18 lives across 3 tours. Had to drag her out of Kandahar because she wouldn't leave wounded behind. She was the most qualified medic I ever worked with. Still is." "That's impossible," Hollis whispered. The park's director stepped forward. Her jaw was locked. "Mr. Hollis, you're terminated effective immediately. Escorted off the grounds. Your actions today constitute grounds for formal investigation." Then the IT technician, a Marine veteran named Graves, tattoos visible on his forearms, held up his laptop. "Mr. Hollis asked me to delete the security footage from the choking incident this afternoon. Specifically requested the camera angle showing him kicking sand toward this gentleman." Graves turned the screen around. Derek Hollis's face, caught mid-sneer, filled the display. "I didn't delete it. I backed it up. Encrypted it. And reported the destruction request to the State Ethics Board 1 hour ago. They're sending investigators tomorrow morning." Hollis opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked at Sarah. At Marcus. At Katie, who was standing at the edge of the crowd now, still in her scrubs because she'd come straight from Sacred Heart when she got Sarah's call. Katie was watching him with the kind of composure that comes from having faced actual death and chosen to keep living anyway. He lunged for Graves. Tried to grab the laptop. The SEAL team leader stepped between them, not aggressively, just present, and Hollis bounced off him like a man running into a wall. He screamed. Actually screamed. About lies, about defamation, about how Katie was lying about her service. How there was no Navy Cross. How they were all conspiring against him. The crowd went dead silent. His voice cracked higher. He started sweating through his shirt. Called Katie a fraud. Called the Navy liars. Demanded his phone to call the mayor. His voice dissolved into something inhuman, rage wrapped in the kind of desperation that only comes when a man realizes his entire life has been built on the assumption that nobody would ever call him out. Police arrived at 6:33 p.m. State investigators at 7:13 p.m. By 8:22 p.m., Derek Hollis was being escorted off the boardwalk in handcuffs while nurses from Sacred Heart stood in silent rows watching him pass. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Just watched. 6 months later, Derek Hollis stood behind a desk at a community college in a strip mall outside Eugene, teaching CPR to 13 students who had no idea who he was. The name tag read Staff Instructor Hollis. He flinched whenever anyone called him Mr. Hollis, the dropping of his title a small death, repeated 8 times a day. Katie stood on the same beach at sunset where it had all ended. Marcus beside her. His worn combat boots placed upright in the sand between them, heel sunk deep, leather creased from a decade of walking terrain that tried to kill him. The Pacific spread out in front of them like a promise finally kept. A children's group played in the waves behind them, 12 kids aged 6 to 14, all of them from families of deployed service members. Katie had started the volunteer program 4 months ago. Every Saturday. Every sunset. Watching kids remember that their parents weren't forgotten, that the cost of service meant something, that sacrifice wasn't invisible. "They're waiting for you," Marcus said quietly. He meant the kids. They'd started asking for Captain Katie. The name had stuck somehow, spreading through the volunteer network. Katie smiled. It was small. It was real. It was the smile of a woman who'd spent years believing her strength had to be hidden, only to discover that visibility, that being seen, that letting people know what she'd survived and what she'd learned, that was its own kind of power. She walked toward the children. Marcus watched her go. Watched her kneel in the sand to help a 6-year-old build something that mattered. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The restraint of someone who'd held lives together with steady hands in the dark, and who'd finally chosen to step into the light. What Derek Hollis didn't understand was simple. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. They move through quiet corridors instead of battlefields. They save lives without anyone ever knowing. But when they're finally revealed, when the world finally sees them, the contrast is so absolute that nobody ever forgets. Sacred Heart added a veterans medical wing within the year. Katie was offered the position of Chief of Trauma Medicine. She turned it down. She wanted to stay in scrubs, checking vitals, holding hands, being the person in the room who understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds. She wanted to mentor the next generation of nurses who might recognize a combat medic when they saw one. She wanted to be present. That's what victory looked like. Not a title. Not recognition. Just the choice to be seen, to be used, to be exactly who you were built to be. The last light touched the water. Katie helped a 7-year-old find a shell. The child looked up at her with the kind of trust that comes from recognizing someone who'd survived and returned to help. Somewhere in Eugene, Derek Hollis taught CPR to teenagers who didn't care about his credentials. Somewhere in Baghdad, the soldiers Katie saved were living lives they wouldn't have had. Somewhere in the future, the children playing in the waves would grow up knowing that the people who serve come home different, but not diminished. Katie Morrison stood in the salt air and the fading light, and for the first time in 7 years, she wasn't running from who she was. She was finally living it. What would you have done if you'd been in Katie's position, stay silent and let Hollis destroy her reputation, or risk everything to let the truth come out? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you've been with us before, welcome back, hit that like button. If you're new, we're glad you're here, please subscribe. Either way, leave a comment and say hello.